Le mien marche. Tu veux que je commence?
She's joining, but she might be running late. She's maybe in session.
See, okay.
Oh, she's here? Okay. Please get her. We're just
Going to
going to wait a
Australia
few
next
minutes.
year. It's going to be quite similar, I think, in terms of the migrant workers and indigenous peoples and key issues.
Raph, on va mettre un countdown après le countdown.
On va mettre le quoi?
Un countdown.
Oh, I do.
Hürmetli hanımlar, efendiler, Halkara Uyghur Cumhuriyeti Parlamento azaları çıkışı başlandı.
ご来場の皆様、ただいまより国際ウイグルフォーラム各国国会議員間の国際会議を始めます。
Ladies and gentlemen, the session at the International Uyghur Forum Global Parliamentarian Convention is now starting.
Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me well? I'll take this as a yes. Perfect. I'm so happy to be here and to open this last panel. I know that attention is always a little bit hard at the end of the day, but I really hope that that will captivate your attention with a passionating, at least for me, topic, which is the UN and how to work through this black box to seek accountability for atrocity crimes. My name is Rafael Viana. I am China Program Manager at the International Service for Human Rights. So just before starting and opening the panel, I'd just like to welcome Arfia Eri, that has joined us.
Thank you.
That is, of course, an inspiring figure that I'm sure that most of us, even the ones outside of Japan, look a lot toward. Arfia Eri is, as you know, a member of the Japanese Parliament and the first Uyghur member of the Japanese Parliament. So I'll give you the floor, Arfia, for a couple of minutes for introductory remarks.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for being here today. I know this is the last session. We have a little interception from neighbors next door. But all good?
Yeah.
All good? Okay. Well, thank you for being here. And I know it's been exciting and harrowing and chilling few days. I'm honored to be called to this panel while our parliament's in session. I'll keep my remarks short. I am also a former UN officer. I worked for the UN Secretariat for about 6 years before running for office. And, you know, we're among the very people at the UN who could perhaps make the biggest difference within the system. So I would like to give them more time. But a few observations from more of a coordination role that I was in. I worked in the Secretariat for a long time, worked on coordination as regards many human rights issues. And what's been striking as regards this particular issue is, I think, two things. One is that because Uyghurs have been dehumanized in the Chinese narrative, not only that, but in the global narrative for so long, there is, and I'm just going to say it because there isn't a better way to say it, there is significant, I think, subconscious apathy towards the suffering of the Uyghur people within the UN system. What I mean by this is that whenever, you know, we have red flags as regards human rights, it comes in things like hate speech on social media. It comes in things like, you know, influential people, political figures starting to say racist things outright without consequences. It comes with things like lack of accountability for disrespect towards a specific group. And it comes, as a systemic way to dehumanize a specific group so that, human rights violations become less noticeable and more acceptable to the community. The UN community is very sensitive to this, right? We've seen many human rights issues. We've seen, things that were close to ethnic cleansing and genocide. That is not the Uyghur issue, other issues, right? We've seen conflict. A lot of my former colleagues are incredibly brave people who would, fly to Ukraine at a heartbeat, who came back from Iraq with so much trauma, who have contributed so much to global peace and security and protection of human rights. All of that is respectable. But what I've noticed is that I think, we're seeing the consequences of decades of Islamophobia, just publicly being allowed on Western media, and that kind of narrative being adopted here in Japan because the West is saying it. We feel like we should be aligned with it sometimes, or because we don't understand the Islamic world better, we'll look to other people to explain it to us, and sometimes it comes through an Islamophobic filter. All of that, I think we're seeing consequences of when we look at why we haven't been able to garner more international support for the Uyghur issue. That's one. I just see less alarmed colleagues, right, within the UN when we talk about the Uyghur issue. If this were any other region, we would have an office, we would have a team, we would have, so much more resources to work on this, and we just don't. And there doesn't seem to be the same amount of motivation as there would be for any other country or any other issue that I've worked on. And for me, frankly, it's been dehumanizing to work in an environment like that, where, you're working for somebody's human rights, everybody's human rights, every single day. You're also getting secondary trauma because you're reading about conflict and war and genocide all the time. Obviously, I wasn't working on the Uyghur portfolio, but you're doing that while your own people are being dehumanized by the very same institution you work for and you believe in. It's been a traumatic experience, and it's been incredibly liberating to be able to come here and to be able to speak my mind and to be able to speak to colleagues who share the same kind of, share the same kind of concerns as I do without having to justify them. And that's the very entry point that we're still working on, is humanizing the Uyghurs. So that's one. Second, of course, is more mainstream. I think it's the growing influence of China in international institutions. China's a beast at international diplomacy. They're really, really good at using international frameworks in their favor, and that's not actually wrong. Japan could do the same. The United States could do the same, and that's the point of diplomacy. And our countries who share similar values as us, we just haven't been able to garner the enough, the same amount of motivation and strategy to make sure that these international institutions not only work for us, but also work for the very reasons they were built for, work for the values that we believe we stand for. We're just letting these institutions be, and we shouldn't. There's many ways for us to influence them. One is member state advocacy. I believe that our esteemed colleagues here would be, very much supported by stronger statements by Japan in different issues, right? Stronger statements by the United States, stronger statements by Australia. That would make your job easier, right? And so as members of parliament here, I think that's one thing we should note, is that member states are just as responsible and just as accountable to make sure that the United Nations works, right? We can't just let this institution be. It's an institution made for member states to make sure that we don't have the kind of conflicts that we've seen during the Second World War, to make sure that we don't have the Holocaust happen again. So I'll end my remarks there, and I very much look forward to learning from esteemed colleagues on the same panel. Thank you, guys.
Thank Thank you so much. I really want to pick up on one thing that you said that really strikes me, and I look also a lot at Zumratai because 80% of my time I'm just working with Zumratai. But something that I'm sure that will really echo here, which is what you mentioned about the subconscious apathy towards the Uyghur issue at the UN, and that's something that we really see. At the International Service for Human Rights, our job is to support human rights activists from whatever they come in using the UN mechanisms to provide them a platform to denounce abuses that they have faced, call for accountability for perpetrators. And our work is based on holding governments and the UN to account to its very first premise, which is that every single person has the right, has fundamental rights, and that we should respect that person's dignity, be it Uyghurs, be it in Myanmar, be it in Israel and Palestine. And it is really hard right now to advocate for this in a way that is principled, and for governments to act upon in a way that is principled. And we're basically fighting this battle, as you say, to fight this subconscious apathy. And it is really hard. But this is why we have an excellent panel today to provide us some insights. And I really hope that this can be as action-oriented as possible, and that I can share with you what I think. Well, Zumratai and I say usually that we're pragmatic optimists towards the UN. We love and hate the UN at the same time, but we're still here a couple of years later, still fighting for accountability measures for the Uyghurs. I just before opening the panel, I want to perhaps just flag a couple of points that are relevant for the context. The first, of course, is why the UN matters, in particular when it's a bureaucracy that is, of course, so slow, so big, so politicized in so many manners. But at least from our perspective and where we see it in Geneva, the UN matters for a couple of reasons. The first one being that it's a very strong and legitimate voice. It is the voice of the international community. And when I say the international community, I want to really say the international community, not what often we hear, which is very often the West, which is a very powerful actor, but where we see an increasing breach between the West and the global South. I think this is something that was mentioned in a couple of other panels. And the UN is one of the only, if not the only space where we can bridge that gap and have a very strong collective voice that responds to grave abuses. And the second one, of course, is that it's one of the few venues where it was possible for Uyghurs to document and denounce, bring evidence. And the mechanisms that are in Geneva are among the few ones in this world, given that China is not part of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. There is no regional human rights mechanism in Asia. Geneva is really one of the few places where you can really bring cases, information, and experts there, such as the ones that are sitting in this panel, are able to take them up, send them to the Chinese government, send them to governments. And this has proven a very important advocacy tool. So I hope that we can unpack a little bit the complexity of the UN. You mentioned the UN Secretariat, and the UN has expert and political bodies, and all of them respond to different motivations and different constraints. And they're often seen together as the UN, but it's a system that works at different speed. Probably we have the fastest part of the UN sitting at this table, and the slowest one, which is member states, sitting in Geneva and in New York. And I think what I want us to discuss today is how can we take stock of what has happened so far. What are the expectations that we can have from the UN system? What are the gaps, and how do we move forward, given the limitations, of course, in particular in terms of documentation and of investigation for future accountability when the day comes when the Chinese government will, of course, sit at a court and response for atrocities. So I'll first turn to you, Ahmed Shahid. Ahmed Shahid, you are a former special rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief. You're also the former foreign minister of the Maldives. Your experience on this issue is extremely vast, and your reports were very compelling in the UN. When you were a special rapporteur, you joined a series of joint statements by over 40 UN experts that have called for an investigation mechanism to look into human rights abuses in China. These happened in 2022 and also in 2020, so it's been almost 4 years now. Could you tell us a little bit more why such an investigation is critically important, and what else would it add in addition to the work that special rapporteurs do at the UN?
Thank you very much. First of all, allow me to express my delight to be here and to meet all of you, especially pay my tribute to Dr. Anaisa and your colleagues in the World in the Congress. And of course, to everybody who's been here for the past 2 days, sharing your insights, your plans and your hopes and your aspirations to move forward. It's also very, very pleasant to hear from Honorable Alfea Eri about a time in UN in particular, but also, of course, the fact that we are convening in Japanese Parliament is so important, I think, for the work that all of us are doing. It's a very, very important signal. More than a signal, it has possibly practical implications as well. I'm also mindful I'm meeting the last day of my eminent colleague, Fanan, the current rapporteur on minority rights issues, and of course my former, current rapporteur, and of course my Essex, I suppose, partner, I could say, in the Human Rights Center in this meeting. Of course, the eminent Zumbrita for excellent work you're doing here. Well, listening to what you were saying just now, I tell my students that the UN doesn't have a single silver bullet for human rights protection. The best thing is to imagine the layered Swiss cheese model of all with a number of holes in it, but add the all layers together, you can create some resistance against the pressures that come on you. So take individually, none of the mechanisms actually will give us what we want. But put together, if we can work together really in a coordinated fashion, then we can have some impact. Now, the reason why I think there were, like I said, even Fanan himself was among the rapporteurs joining me in this call. It was all of us actually making the statement, was that as thematic mandate holders, we have the whole world to cover. And we are, of course, by the code of conduct, required to cover globally. And also, we have to look at all situations in a fair manner. But because we had consistently flagged concerns about China in our reports, all of us felt that rather than look at China in these very, if you like, bits and pieces, and the Uyghur issue and everything else as well, under items 2, which is about all human rights of everybody, and item 9 on Durban Declaration, we need to move to item 4 of the Human Rights Council, which is situations that require attention of the Council, meaning of grave violations. That would mean, ideally, getting a full-time person focused on the country. To use Ambassador Curry's words yesterday, a pebble in the shoe, yes, but perhaps a bunch of pebbles, but not just pebbles, but a pair of eyes constantly, shedding light on what China is doing. I say this because I also worked previously as a reporter on Iran for 6 years, and I have a sense that that had some impact. Maybe I'm exerting my own work there, but I do think Iran actually cared about what was being done to mandate. More than that, it offered opportunity to work with the Iranian rights defenders, build their capacity, and also more than that, I also worked with other states. A large part of my work as a country reporter was not just focusing on the country I decided to look at, but also other governments telling them, where's your bit? Like you said, where is your piece here? What are you doing here? Say in China's case, China bothers to go to the 5th committee of the GA. Who goes there? But it's very important because that's where the budgets are approved. You approve something somewhere else, budget committee cuts it out, you have no legs. So it requires that all of that engagement. What we said actually were 3 things. Create a country mechanism, that's ideal, but requires a number of votes for that. Or even better, a panel of experts, because that has enough hands to really pick up the evidence and get it there. That requires a vote as well. But okay, if you can't get that, then envoy of the Secretary General, he can do it without necessarily going through a system. But that again is a single dedicated voice, well-resourced, well-regarded, powerful enough to do all things a rapporteur can do possibly. Well, not everything, but very much like that. But in the absence of a rapporteur, that is very, very, very important. Now, why do I say this? Because all of us know China is listening right now, because it cares. Of course, unlike Iran or unlike many countries, China has nothing to worry about economically and militarily, of course, but they have a huge social vulnerability because they can't afford to have the UN pick China up in that fashion, right? That means they have a stigma for them from the perspective. So if there was a possibility of the Council taking China under item 4 or even something close to that, that's a problem for them. But more than a problem, it also means that there is now a mechanism for all of us here gathered here to go and work with constantly, regularly, not just in passing, but a constant report on that. Imagine 2 reports a year to the Council, to the UN, discussing this issue. My passing comments were met with extreme anger from Chinese delegates. Imagine a full report, full 90 minutes on this. And of course, not just anger here, it's just empowering those who are without a voice. also mobilizing other people to come and join, and then really, I think, all the long run making some momentum. I will end by saying, I know it's difficult to get the votes here, but the High Commissioner's report last year identified 7 mandates who had made requests to visit and were denied a chance to go there. Now, I do think it is possible for these 7 mandate holders, the current mandate holders, because they were denied this chance to go there, and because it's mentioned in the report, to hold, in my view, 3 press conferences a year when they report to the Council in March or June or September or into the GA, whereby they come together and talk about their ongoing concerns about China and the Uyghur situation and other matters they have. So there is that focus there. This doesn't require resolution. This requires the resolve of these 7 rapporteurs, and I hope that you can persuade them to do this. This has been done before, in passing, I suppose. On Sri Lanka, we did this, and I think it's done on other countries as well. So there's a possibility. So there is an interim opportunity to do something to tell everybody China is item 4, and from there on, then you go to the what's required. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I do have another question for you, and you mentioned something that it also it shows the importance of the UN space, which is saving face is so important. And as you say, the stronger the government rebukes allegations at the UN, the more that it actually means that it cares about this. And we see this. I see this in Geneva very, very often. In terms of the very strong opposition that the government gets. Now, in what you're saying, something that is also very key is that any form of investigation, that would need, as you say, more hands looking into the evidence is a pre-requirement for accountability for any justice process. And when other parts of the UN system are blocked, such as the Security Council, of course, where China has a veto, or more political parts of the UN, such as the Secretary General, who need to appoint an envoy, but where we don't necessarily see so far willingness to do so. The Human Rights Council has been one of the few places in this very polarized world where very grave situations actually were met with an adequate response in terms of investigation, etc. There are a few exceptions, and one of them, of course, is this one. Last year, as everybody knows, after the UN published its reports finding possible crimes against humanity committed, a draft resolution at the Human Rights Council was proposed by a group of countries, and it was one of the few resolutions in the history of the Human Rights Council to be defeated by a very narrow margin of 3 votes. From 17 yes to 19 no's, knowing that we need a majority of yeses, and a number of governments that have abstained. I think what strikes us a lot is that actually a number of members of the OIC, of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, abstained or voted against it. That includes Qatar, that includes Indonesia, that includes Kazakhstan, that includes Pakistan. Now, I guess I also appeal to your experience as a former foreign minister, also of the Maldives, a government that now sits at the Human Rights Council. How do we engage with those governments when such a resolution is brought back to the Human Rights Council?
Well, thank you. I think we had a session, I think earlier today we spoke about this issue, and we had a very heated discussion about this. But having worked in a government and also looking at different issues, as Idris was saying here earlier, my main takeaway is that the OIC, 56 member states, isn't one. It's often led by 4 or 5, louder voices. But there are dissenting voices within. Even in the vote, we saw Albania and others not take part in that. But in even a general meeting, you have some of the states like, I would say, the Gambia, Senegal, many others, often, even Jordan sometimes, don't really follow the pack, as it were. So the most important thing would be unpack the OIC into its small bits and get to know each state individually. And within each state, also know the players individually, because they are also bureaucracies. They all have their own personal agendas, worries, concerns, ambitions, and so on and so forth. Get to that level, that micro level. Then see, again, the option is not yes or no. Option could be even not turning up. It could be an absent vote or, of course, abstention as well. But an absent vote also matters. And then not just the OIC, look at others who abstain and see if you can convert them into a positive. This is going to be a very difficult task, but I think the challenge is how to unpack this into smaller bits and to begin to work on that. There are many divisive debates within the OIC on death penalty, on LGBTI rights, and not everybody is the same voice. At the end, they come together, but There are many different voices within. So I think that is something we need to work on. And also more broadly, I think we also focus on creating a dissonance within the government, within the countries of what the governments are doing. Of course, I think the biggest driver here is the economic dependence on China. That probably can't change until we go and change the World Bank, IMF, and the Western countries give aid to other countries. But that's not happening. But that dependence will remain. But then also within many of these countries actually also have elections. And there are different parties within the different orientation. In my own country, there's a pro-India party and a pro-China party. I think we missed a beat when the pro-India party was in office to actually get that vote for the Uyghur community. Now we have a pro-China government coming in, and we have to see where we go with that. But the thing is, there is difference within each state. We need to work at that level. And then I was also listening to this morning's debate, wondering, perhaps we ask Pew or Gallup or somebody to do a poll of what Muslims in these countries think and know about the Uyghur situation. Now you put Palestine, everybody's in the streets. Kashmir, we don't care. Rest of India, bulldoze homes, we don't care. Burn the Quran, we care. I mean, what is going on? Something not right here, right? So I think it's not just the Uyghur situation. I think it's a situation of how these countries, people understand things. Of course, also, bear in mind, these are not often democracies. People may have aspirations, they can't express them. And like you said, we spent decades suppressing the religious voice in this country. So now we can't actually mobilize them. Also, I am wary of using religion as a way to mobilize anything. But I think that people care in these countries. And if we really get to the nitty-gritty level of finding some resonance, I think bureaucracy is good to some extent. I think legal action is very good where it works. But we also have to think beyond the law and beyond institutions. We have to find ways to resonate with the people. This morning I mentioned framing issues through corruption, anti-corruption drive. Why are these governments supporting China? Is there corruption involved in this? There often is. How to address that? We have seen in Iran time and time again how women stand up against patriarchy and autocracy and so on and so forth. Perhaps there is some links to build there. So I think find ways to build multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder, multi-dimensional relationships. Although my mandate is ended, I am looking at building coalitions. I'm very much motivated by the Uyghur community's work. I haven't told anybody this, but I was preparing a report, an annex to my report, a final report on China. I couldn't put it through because of the timing of China's approval for the visit of the High Commissioner, which came in March. My report was in March, so I couldn't do that. It wasn't fair for me to kind of just put something up when she was going to go there. But I think they knew my report was coming. Of course, they knew. And that was one of the reasons for the timing of it. But the point is, so much work to be done, and we can do it. And I'm looking to work with everybody, building that coalition across different groups to get there. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm very curious about that annex. So I think you mentioned something important, which is this people-to-people engagement that is very important beyond just government-to-government engagement too. And how do we engage, and the challenge of engaging with people and with populations outside of the democratic frameworks. Now, I'll turn to you, Zumretai, precisely to talk about another group of countries that have abstained or opposed this resolution that was so important for us to move ahead for accountability at the UN, which is democracies, but from the global south. So we had a number of abstentions from countries that traditionally are very supportive of human rights, such as Argentina, Mexico, and Brazil, and a number of African countries such as Namibia or Cote d'Ivoire, who even voted against, while usually being much more supportive on other situations. So how do we engage with those? What needs to happen in these countries for these governments to actually comply with their traditional foreign policy positions, or piggybacking on what Ahmed just said about pro-India or pro-China? How can we break away from the pro-China, pro-US dynamic and actually build a pro-human rights position in those countries?
Thank you, Raf. Actually, that's a really complicated question that you asked me, because I think I've spent every day in the last 4 years asking myself the same question. And I'm still figuring it out as we go. I think we're figuring it out with allies, with you together. Based on my experience at the UN in the past 4 years in Geneva, it's one thing that is necessary, and it's the base of everything is openness. Openness to discuss these issues in a secure manner, because oftentimes us community members, Uyghur human rights defenders, Tibetan human rights defenders, Chinese human rights defenders, we face huge risks when we advocate for our community's rights. The number of times I was followed at the UN, photographed against my will, and just, you know, these kind of instances that make you feel unsafe to be even present advocating for your community's rights at the UN. So I think the openness to discuss these things in safe environment is extremely important, and I think this is what we have with most democracies. When we meet with missions, I feel most of the time I feel safe, but I feel less safe when I meet with countries that are very close to China or have endorsed China on many occasions at the UN. So I think this is something that that is kind of the base. And also, I mean, this spring we also went together on a very huge journey in Latin America for an advocacy, 2-week advocacy in Brazil, Argentina, Costa Rica, and Chile. And one thing that we've realized is that actually they can be open to have these conversations that are necessary to advance human rights, because actually at the end of the day, our issues are similar. I think for us it was a very interesting trip, because we realized that the people in these countries and civil society actors and many of the stakeholders have actually can relate to our stories, because what we were discussing were issues like enforced disappearances, arbitrary detention, family separation, forced labor. They all related to our stories, and they actually learned a lot, because what they were you know, hearing all the time was kind of the Chinese propaganda, the Chinese narrative, because China has so much influence and power over these countries, or even in the public opinion there, that it made such a difference to actually be present in the capital and to engage with the people ourselves, and not let, you know, just media do the work, because most of the time we don't know what kind of information they're being, you know, distributed to. So I think that's one thing that's necessary, is that if we want to change the narrative, it takes in-person advocacy. I think that's what we learn, is go to capitals, go to Geneva, and actually meet them. Sometimes, I mean, in Geneva it's more complicated. They just don't want to meet us, especially when they hear Uyghur, they're immediately scared. And it happened also in capitals. I mean, the number of meetings that were canceled because of Chinese pressure, every stakeholder that we wanted to meet in these countries, the Chinese government or the Chinese embassy called them to actually urge them not to meet with us. So I think this is, there's also like this, there needs to be some sort of risk that they are willing to take, the opposition. So a political will, a political courage to meet with human rights defenders that are affected by these issues. And I think there's a huge need to push back against the Chinese narrative that, you know, there's no issue with in the region, in East Turkestan. I think there's a lot to do on that, but also a lot to do with also awareness raising and educating the public and changing the public opinion in these places. Because most of the civil society actors that we've met, they were very keen to help. They were very supportive, and they said, we didn't know. We just didn't know. It was a matter of lack of awareness. Now that we have heard your stories, your personal stories, I remember the numerous times when Dolkun shared his personal story of how his mother died in a concentration camp, or how he's been cut off from his family members, or how I have been cut off with my family members. The people were very, very emotional, and they said, let us help you. So I think it takes a lot, but also not so much if people are willing to help.
Thank you. Again, reinforcing the importance of kind of like people-to-people engagement, and really to be present in this question of how do we build bridges across countries, and not only, of course, with the West, but with others in the global South. And I think something that you mentioned is very important, is really the value of human story, the value of storytelling, the value of sharing what you've been through. and that's perhaps the most effective way to counter a narrative, and in particular in spaces where, you know, human rights advocacy is framed as Western or Westernized. How do we break away from this? Well, we appeal to every person's humanity by sharing your own story, and as you say, building bridges, right? Now, I have another question for you, which is, as you know very well, the UN system is complex, has different, has different actors evolving in there. We talked about the OACHR report, the UN Human Rights Office report. We talked about the Human Rights Council, that is mostly a political body. We are here with UN special rapporteurs. There's also UN committees sitting in Geneva that periodically analyze the situation in China. But something that, we have seen is a lack of trust from the Uyghur community, or a trust, if I could say instead, that was eroded because of specific steps that parts of the UN have taken. So I think that was particularly strong during the time of High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet, her, if I may say, catastrophic visit to China, and the fact that her report, which was excellent, came in perhaps a little bit too late. So that didn't contribute to the trust. How can we rebuild that? What are the expectations from your perspective of the Uyghur community towards the UN, and what all these different bodies, again, that evolve at different speeds, have to do to rebuild that trust?
I think you're right. For us Uyghurs, it's been very challenging. I think everyone can imagine how hard it is to be separated from your family members for so long. I mean, you don't speak to your loved ones for 1 week, and it feels already long enough. So imagine 5, 6, 7 years with no communication at all, when digital communication has never been easier and more accessible than ever. So I think for us, in the beginning, there was a real momentum after during the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination's review on China in 2018, and during the UPR, Universal Periodic Review on China in 2018, there was real momentum because for the first time there were major headlines in major outlets like BBC, New York Times, Reuters, and so many others in every single language. And we said at the time, Uyghurs, we said, finally, although we were living, going through crimes against humanity, genocide, we said, finally, our voice is being heard. I remember demonstrations were being held by our organization in front of the UN, in front of, when it was happening, and we were just making pleas. Please, the UN, listen to us. And it felt like it was finally our moment, and we put so much trust and so much hope into the system. And so when the concluding observations, recommendations came out, I mean, there was, especially the third one, it was a very historic moment because it was the first time that the UN, a UN body, acknowledged the issue or classified the issue as being severe, and said that there were at least 1 million of Uyghurs in concentration camps. And so at that time, we all thought, that's it, we got it. We have something at the UN, and it did help a lot. But of course, since then, I have not seen anything happen to hold the Chinese government to account. And I think in between 2018 and now, there were a few steps that were taken, but there were so many, challenges that came along, especially around the issuing of the High Commissioner's report last August and the catastrophic visit. There were so many emotions in our community. We were, some people were saying, oh, this is great because finally a UN expert gets to visit the place. And then there were also opinions like, oh, well, she's not going to have access because it's just pure propaganda. The government is using this for their own benefit. And this is exactly what happened. It was a disastrous show, and I think it did not help anything. It didn't advance the cause. It did not, the Chinese government was not held accountable. And then the next Human Rights Council session after that report was issued, we know what happened. A resolution was led by UN member states, a coalition of like-minded countries, and we both know how much we worked hard for this, but meeting diplomats, and they were telling me, well, no, we can't really vote on this because, you know, it's the technicality around it, how like the visit and everything, it made it difficult for us to vote in favor. And so our community was once again, you know, disappointed, but also we felt like we were being abandoned, basically, because we had all of these materials. I mean, in the past few years, special rapporteurs have done so much. I think this is literally the only mechanism at the UN that has actually helped with treaty bodies, to help report, help document abuses, help highlight the issue. And they have done such amazing work, and we are so appreciative of their work. And I think our community is only thanking them, because the UN system as a whole has failed our community and has continuously, you know, done so. And also member states. I mean, how difficult is it to vote yes on a situation that deserves the merit of, deserves the attention of everyone? And I just want to end by saying that last November 23, 2022, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination adopted its Decision 108 on serious human rights violations committed in the region under its early warning and urgent action procedure, and through which it refers for the first time the matter to the attention of the Special Advisor of the Secretary General on the Responsibility to Protect, like the Joint Office. It was the first time, and in the very short decision, which is very clear and comprehensive, it actually put the responsibility on member states to act on this issue, on this genocide. But that's been very challenging. We both know this. Nothing has happened since. So I think it's safe to say that the Uyghur community feels like they've been abandoned by the entire UN body. But again, we're still there. We're still working in the system, because we also know that this is perhaps the only place where our voice can be heard at this level.
Thank you, Zumratay. I think you know, the conclusion here is that the role of UN member states and, you know, reaching out beyond our traditional allies is really important, not only to move towards an investigation, but also to rebuild trust. Now, if we take a couple of steps back, and we understand the need for documentation and investigation, but looking at what has been done already at the UN system level, the OACHR report finds the possible commission of crimes against humanity in relation to mass-scale arbitrary detention. However, of course, there's a lot of other elements that you know, support the commission of international crimes. And this is why I'd like to turn to you, Monsieur de Varenne. This is well, one of your last occasions to speak about this as a special rapporteur on minority issues, so it's an honor to be at the end of your mandate on this, and you've done so much for the cause. You've analyzed it from a lot of different angles. Now, we have this conclusion that links crimes against humanity with arbitrary detention. What else is missing in the legal analysis of the international crimes committed by the Chinese government?
Merci beaucoup, Rafael. Obrigado. Good afternoon, everyone. Konnichiwa. Hayerlik Kunduz. Sorry for that. Bonjour tout le monde. Assalamu alaikum. Well, first of all, I'd like to express my gratitude to the Uyghur Parliamentary Caucus, the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, the Japan Uyghur Association, and the World Uyghur Congress for the honor of being part of this forum. This is the very last day of my mandate as Special Rapporteur on Minorities, and you know what? I can't think of any better way to celebrate that. My response will be short. Everything that Ahmed said. There's an expression in English. Sometimes we can't see the forest from the trees, and I think there is a tendency. I'll begin with that. There's a tendency at the United Nations mechanism to focus on individuals. Sometimes, of course, and when we talk about crimes against humanity, on a very large number of individuals whose rights in international law are not being respected. But there is more than individuals being attacked or mistreated. What we're seeing is, I think, an element which perhaps is not sufficiently reflected. whole communities are targeted. Now, there has been, as we've heard, a number of, or in fact, many statements and a number of communications from special procedures, including myself, on the situation of the Uyghur and other minorities, including the Tibetans. And by the way, as someone mentioned that earlier today, we had a communication last February on about 1 million Tibetan children who were actually removed from their families for most of their childhood and put into residential schools. My mandate and a few others just issued another communication just a few weeks ago in relation to the Uyghur and other Turkic or Muslim children. And this was on the 23rd of September. So it's relatively fresh, and perhaps some of you are not familiar with it. But in this communication a few weeks ago, we express our very grave concerns over allegations of a significant expansion of Xinjiang's state-run boarding school system, which fails to provide education in the children's mother tongue, but also forcibly or involuntarily separates hundreds of thousands. There's allegations of perhaps even as many as 800,000 Uyghur and other minority Muslim children being removed from their families and communities, leading to what? Well, leading to their forced assimilation, to the loss of connection with their families and communities, and undermining their ties to their culture, religion, and linguistic identities. Now, in other countries in the past, what I just described, for example, in Canada and Australia and others, what I just described in history would be called genocide. This is what the removal of indigenous children from their families has been recognized at. But what I just described, even those communications are just the trees. There is also a forest. There's something systematic happening in China, which I think we're failing to capture. There are also claims of sterilization of Uyghur and other minority women, of destruction of mosques. In fact, I heard a percentage of perhaps 65% of mosques being destroyed. Old historical sites also being eliminated. Expropriation of traditional and pastoral lands. That started decades ago. Some of you may be old enough to remember the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, how it actually seized control of huge amounts of land and also assuming control over many aspects of social and economic life, which favors Han over indigenous Uyghurs. You have the insertion of Han and other Chinese into Uyghur families under the United as One Family program. Think of it. You're forced to accept a stranger to live within your own family. How much that is an infringement on your private and family life. And all of this and many other aspects we really are not focusing on very much, are we? How many times have you heard about this at the United Nations? Almost never. The immense, massive restrictions on freedom of religion happening in Xinjiang, especially amongst a Uyghur family. We've heard about modern forms of slavery, and what we do not account is for the overall objectives and effects of what is involved. It involves millions and millions of people. The scale is staggering, the effect destructive, even, well, we could say inhumane. The report by the OHCHR, for example, found that serious human rights violations have been committed in Xinjiang, and the implementation of strategies and associated policies has led to interlocking patterns of severe and undue restrictions on the wide range of human rights. And the report continues, often directly or indirectly affect Uyghur and other predominantly Muslim communities. The problem with diplomats and even the United Nations is sometimes we're too polite, aren't we? This is way too timid. The report talks about possibly a massive 10 to 20% of the adult population being in some form of detention or so-called vocational education and training centers in 2017 and 2018. 10 to 20% of the adult population. What is this? In most other countries of the world, this would be seen as a massive intrusion and incarceration of your civilian population. Think about that. In any other civilized society, what should we be doing? We should be crying, shouting from the rooftops that this is completely inhumane, uncivilized. This is my last day as Special Rapporteur. Now, the report of the OHCHR, the Office of the High Commissioner, highlights credible reports on the destruction of religious shrines and mosques, the banning of certain Muslim names, the banning of the wearing of religious symbols, large-scale incarceration of minorities, as we mentioned, long separation of families, including children, bans on the types of clothing, all in the name of fighting extremism, as possible violations of basic human rights. It also points out that the language of Uyghur and other minority languages have been almost completely replaced by Putonghua, Mandarin for others, as medium of instruction in education, except maybe for a token few hours a week in most schools. There are other aspects which were perhaps not sufficiently developed in the UN report. How children have been separated from their parents, not sufficiently reported. How there are programs to encourage Uyghur women to marry Han Chinese. Really? Is this what we're talking about? I could make some other comments, but I think we are seeing extreme measures that do not exist, to my knowledge, in any other country in the world. We have extreme restrictions on religious practices. There are programs to encourage Uyghurs to leave Xinjiang, to work or study outside the region. There is apparently a dramatic and disproportionate drop compared to the rest of China in the number of Uyghur children now being born, along with claims of forced sterilization and birth control. What is missing at the United Nations, what is missing from the OHCHR report, is that the result of all of these efforts must be the intentional and forced assimilation of Uyghurs and others, such as Tibetans, in fact, we should mention them also, who are facing similar types of restrictions. And it's logical to interpret these as intentional measures in order to erase the Uyghur identity as a community. Their language, their culture, their history, and their religion, except for occasional tokenistic and folkloric dancing and singing. I find that quite offensive, by the way, but that's another issue. It is difficult not to see a systemic attempt to destroy an entire civilization, a nation. The Uyghur and other Turkic minorities, but also Tibetans, and increasingly, by the way, the Hui Muslim minority also, they seem to be treated, we're talking about millions of people, they seem to be treated collectively as a threat. And it's not only individuals that are targeted. Remember, we at the United Nations focus on individual rights, as we do, as we must. But we seem to have much more here. There are communities which are targeted massively and specifically linked to the rise, and I would say instrumentalization by the CCP of Han nationalism. It's a simulation for more complete domination or control or even erasing. Secondly, and I will end soon because I am told there's a time limit. Secondly, whether we call the situation involving the Uyghurs and other Turkic minorities a possible genocide or crimes against humanity or massive human rights violations, no allegations should be excluded. In other words, use every single tool that you can. What is occurring in Xinjiang and Tibet is so massive, of such a scale and gravity, and with such glaring and unrelenting intent and drive, that the international community can no longer, in my opinion, be passive or silent. But currently, there is no mechanism that could collect and preserve, as Ahmed has mentioned, evidence from Xinjiang and engage on the issue of international crimes in relation to international law. Myself and other colleagues, as has been mentioned earlier today, called on the Human Rights to convene a special session on China. Not very successfully, obviously. We've heard about the resolution also. But still, I would go still further and continue to call for states to work together to table a resolution at the Human Rights Council if possible. Did not succeed, but it could succeed eventually, as we've heard. Or the UN General Assembly. I think there's also possibilities there that need to be looked, to establish an independent investigation mechanism for the collection and preservation of evidence of potential crimes and massive violations of human rights. And this has been done before, as we've heard, with Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Ukraine, to name but a few. Perhaps the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights could actually be convinced to establish a kind of working group or expert, special independent expert, to focus on the scale and, in fact, almost unheard of massive violation of human rights that we have. Now, let me be blunt. I was not blunt earlier, so now I'm going to be blunt. No, that's a very bad joke, sorry. If the international community can do it for these and others, including the Ukraine, by the way, then the exceptional nature and large-scale gross violations that are claimed against minorities in Xinjiang demand action from the United Nations and international community. Even if it has not yet been successful, it does not mean it could not happen. With the lobbying efforts, with the pathways, the suggestions, the policy approaches, which have been mentioned yesterday and today. To paraphrase Martin Luther King Jr., to do nothing, to be silent, is to be an accomplice. And silence is no longer an option. The important thing is to focus on despite the setbacks, despite the reluctance or inability of the United Nations to act in any real, tangible way, still, the international community cannot allow itself to do nothing and to be an accomplice. We must not be silent, but continue efforts to seek justice for those inside of China who cannot defend themselves. For in the end, we should still be guided by the fundamental document of our humanity at the end of the Second World War, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, that proclaims in the very first words of the preamble that the recognition of the inherent dignity and equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. We, the United Nations and the international community, have probably failed miserably to guarantee freedom, justice, and hence also peace. And we're seeing the consequences today. We have more violent conflicts around the world today than at any time since the end of the Second World War. And it suggests that we need to correct, to do much better, to do more, because what we have done in ignoring the situation in Xinjiang and other parts of the world, I think has directly led to the situation, the critical situation we have today around the world, in many parts of the world. And that's what we must work towards, keeping the pressure on, especially now, despite the failings of the international institutions such as the United Nations and the failings of member states also, even liberal democracies and others, which should actually be supporting, addressing what is happening now. Freedom, justice, and peace for Uyghur, Tibetans, and others. Freedom, justice, and peace. Merci. Domo arigato. Aramai. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. And I think this was a very moving and inspiring way to finish your mandate. I hope that was to the level. We can reassure you that from the perspective of those of us who sit in Geneva, we're not going to leave that city until we get a resolution to addressed at the Human Rights Council, so we can rest reassured. But I think you mentioned a couple of points that are important. Of course, first, the complexity of the system, and that complexity gives room for creativity. And the second is that, despite how we call what's happening to the Uyghur people, it's important to address every single part of it. And there's a couple of areas that you enumerated where we need more documentation. Now, I'd like to turn to our last but very distinguished panelist, Professor Obokata, who is currently the UN Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of slavery. So you're part of this body that should have started by explaining which are the special procedures. So a technical name, we like this in Geneva, but that basically refers to the UN-appointed special rapporteur, so independent experts. In your report last year to the Human Rights Council, you concluded, your thematic report, you concluded that some instances of Uyghur forced labor might amount to enslavement as a crime against humanity. Could you walk us a little bit more through that finding, and in particular, what do you need, what kind of support do you need to continue to do this vital documentation work from the side of special rapporteurs?
Well, thank you very much. 皆様こんばんは。私は日本人で小保方智也と申します。ただいま国連人権理事会で現代的形態の奴隷制担当の国連特別報告者を務めております。I'm just going to stop my Japanese here because in interest of the majority of the audience, and plus, to be honest, my Japanese is not that great, given that I've been living abroad for more than half of my life, so please forgive me, but I'll try to speak slowly. Well, thank you very much for that question. Just to give you a little bit of information, I decided to do a report on exploitation of minorities last year to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Declaration of the Rights of Minorities. And then as Ahmed said, we cover globally, so I examine different parts of the area, including the treatment of Uyghur populations in Xinjiang province. And so that's I decided to do, and that part got a global attention, which I was very pleased to see that. And it's one of the key tasks of the special procedures like ourselves to promote international standards with respect to our own mandates. And in my case, that includes, of course, international human rights law, international labor law, as well as international criminal law. And in terms of the definition of enslavement, I looked at the Article 7 of the Statute of International Criminal Court, and definition under that is exactly the same as the one given under the Slavery Convention 1926, which is the most important instrument for my mandate. Now, in a nutshell, the key aspects of slavery or enslavement is the exercise of powers over individuals. And there is a strong dependency relationship between the controller and those who have been controlled. And they feel that the powers or control exercised over them are so strong that they cannot escape from their situation. And the only choice is to oblige. The indicators of slavery may include, but are not limited to, internment and detention, constant surveillance, threat or violence, including of a sexual nature, as well as abusive living and working conditions. And in my report, I applied law into these indicators and came to my own conclusion on enslavement as a crime against humanity in various cases. The same, of course, is true for the existence of forced labor, which is a slightly different conduct, lesser than slavery, but again, there were clear indicators of forced labor in many cases. So the question is, how did I identify these indicators to reach my conclusions? Well, I relied on a wide variety of sources, such as submissions by stakeholders, independent academic research, reports published by civil society and international organizations, and judicial decisions of international tribunals. I also held individual consultations in which some of you have here today have kindly took part, and I was also able to speak to victims and witnesses of labor and sexual exploitation. Now, as independent experts, we must be fair to all sides in collecting information. In this regard, I also received and analyzed information provided by the government of China and Chinese scholars based in the country who produced some research in this area. And I also sent my draft to the government and held a virtual consultation so that I could listen to their side of the story. And after this, what I did was to cross-check all information I carefully received and test the validity of each piece of information and obtain a credible narrative as to what has been happening in Xinjiang province. And my conclusion, once again, the forced labor has been in existence in that region, and some instances, at least some instances, may amount to enslavement as a crime against humanity. Now, obviously, the best scenario is to visit China and conduct an independent investigation, but after publishing my report, I'm not sure that is going to happen, but I'll keep trying, sending a request to visit that country so that I can have a proper investigation. So the best I could do in that report was to provide a reasonable conclusions as opposed to definitive conclusions, but I think evidence is overwhelming from a wide variety of sources. So to conclude, I did not really rely on one or two sources. I've examined volumes of evidence. I could not put everything in the report because I was told to cut down the footnotes because simply it was too large. So I have to cut down. But so what is needed for documentation? So we would very much appreciate continued cooperation from you. Those who have been victimized in these atrocious practices, as well as those organizations working in a field to protect and promote the rights of Uyghur, Tibetan, and other minorities who have been suffering. And the of paramount importance, in my view, is testimonies from victims and witnesses. And this afternoon, I was listening to Ms. Stilic about the importance of listening and trusting what they have said. And I have done that last year. I did trust the testimonies of witnesses and victims, and will continue to do so. So please, I would like to salute you and others for their courage and integrity in coming forward and providing. I know that it must have been so painful to provide this kind of information to us, but I was very touched by your statement this afternoon. I was very touched by the people who have provided information to me directly last year, and I would like, if possible, please continue to do so through your colleagues, through directly to any of us. We are not some abstract entities who only speak to member states. No, we are very much, we stand beside you. So please do approach us anytime you want to, and I very much look forward to working with you. And I'd like to close by thanking, I'm very honored, first of all, to join a panel with esteemed colleagues, my special procedures colleagues, and congratulations on your very last day. And I'm glad that you are spending your last day in my own country. And thank you very much for Ms. Afia for coming with us. And finally, thank you very much to the organizers, Congress and Japan Association, for inviting me and my colleagues this afternoon. So thank you. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Oh, yeah. Listen.
Thank you so much, Professor Bukata. Again, I think that the strength of your report, from what you say, really stems from the conjunction of the courage of those who decide to testify, and the rigor, of course, of your analysis, and those things together really bring us to a very strong conclusion that echoed a lot at the right moment just before the Human Rights Council considered the resolution. I believe we have a few minutes perhaps for Q&A after this very rich conversation. So I would like to perhaps take up to 2 questions given the time, and then give a chance for our panelists to respond. I see Professor Zen and gentleman on the right. Yes, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't bring my glasses, which was a very big mistake. So
Thank you very much. I have a question for probably any of the rapporteurs, potentially in particular Mr. Obokata. In my research on forced labor, I really see a strong correlation between the types of forced labor, of labor transfer as a form of human trafficking. And I know that human trafficking is explicitly the area of a separate rapporteur, and I would be very interested if this rapporteur has been at all sort of engaging on the issue, is interested, or if one could maybe stimulate interest or sort of make some progress so that we have both the aspect of forced labor and the aspect of human trafficking, because labor transfers really remove Uyghurs, and that's part of a population strategy to transfer them. And of course, in my report in 2021, on the Nankai report, I had several international legal experts do an evaluation, including former Ambassador Stephen Rapp, and they came to the conclusion that labor transfers could constitute the crime of humanity of forcible transfer. So that's my question. But we're collecting questions. Who's next?
So I have two questions. One's very general and anybody could answer, which is, to my knowledge, the General Secretary has never said anything about this, and I'm wondering why. The other question is particularly for Special Rapporteur Devaranis, who was talking about the focus on individual rights. I'm wondering if, to my knowledge, the one area of the UN that deals with collective rights is the indigenous rights and the Special Rapporteur for indigenous issues. And do you think that that is a strategy that has any usefulness for the Uyghur movement in terms of getting the attention of the Special Rapporteur for indigenous issues as well?
Thank you. I think we have time for a third. I see a gentleman over there. I'm sorry, I have to arbitrarily limit time.
As the conference is concluding, I think it would be very helpful also to remember that Japan has her own indigenous people who amazingly were only recognized as indigenous people of Japan 4 years ago, and they still have not had their rights restored for their basic cultural issues of fishing. So don't forget that the indigenous people of Japan look very different than the Japanese. Their view is that they were colonized essentially by Chinese. And just 4 years ago, they were recognized. So please don't forget the Ainu, the indigenous people of Japan, who are very proud and consider this country originally theirs.
Thank you. And since this was also not a question, I still want to ask if there's one last question. Can we perhaps get a mic? Sorry.
My question is, before the release of the human rights, UN Human Rights Office last year, and there was the media report that the Chinese government officials, till the last minute, tried to water down the special wordings in the report. Just I would like to know if that is the case, if there's any reduction or any change of the wordings of the report before releasing it by the Chinese government. This is my first question. And secondly, and in your report, and you talked about the possible commission of enslavement and forced labor, and the drop of birth rate of the Uyghur women and reduction of population. And so in Canada, for example, the transfer of the indigenous children to residential school, that was enough to call it genocide, and the Canadian government called that. Why you fail to call it genocide when it comes to Uyghurs? And you mentioned a number of the criminal, the elements of the genocide, the convention, just like the transfer of children from one group to another, that is the element of genocide, why you did not just to call it genocide then?
Sure. The first question on the trafficking, yes, I do agree that trafficking by definition is moving someone against their will. And if they have been transferred, of course, that is human trafficking. And Shimon Mulally, the Special Rapporteur on Trafficking, and I work very closely, along with Special Rapporteur on Minorities. Oftentimes, we send communications to the government and other entities together. So a couple of years ago, we sent a communication to about 150 companies, which had link to the Xinjiang province, and that includes Japanese companies, American companies, European companies. So we do that quite often, and I think she has expressed her concern over the Xinjiang and Uyghur, and also Tibetan situations. So I think we are very much, so one of the good things about us is that we do work quite well together. So that's that. And then the question on the potential interference by Chinese government. As I said, I did send a draft, and I did not change anything, and I did listen. So my job was to collect all information, as I said, and again, validate and triangulate each piece of information, and then come to my own conclusion as to what is reasonable to conclude. So no, I mean, I think even China does respect our independence. We are independent, so entity. We are appointed by the council, but we are not an official employee of the United Nations. We do not receive salary. We do this on a voluntary basis, so that makes us quite independent. And then the government, I have not been threatened or anything like that. We did have a conversation, but still, I was able to publish in a way. But I know the High Commissioner's office is different because she did admit that she was under. Okay. But she was under the enormous pressure, as I understand it, but she managed to do it a few hours before she left the office, I suppose. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. In terms of collective rights, may I just say that, in fact, there's a little bit more than that, than the right of self-determination of indigenous peoples. In fact, the right of self-determination is a collective right of peoples, not limited to indigenous peoples. And the question becomes, well, who is a people? And the concept has changed over time. And we now include indigenous people who are not originally considered to have any kind of right of self-determination. But that's one right, a collective right. You might even say the prohibition of genocide, because it actually refers to an ethnic, racial, or religious group that is actually threatened of being eliminated as a group itself. So I think there is an important collective aspect here, which obviously is significant also in relation to the Uyghurs. And finally, even though it's not strictly a collective right, if you look at Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which says that persons who belong to a ethnic, religious, and linguistic minority have the right, with other members of their community, to practice their own religion, enjoy their own culture, or use their own language. That could almost be said to be a collective right, or a significant right with a collective aspect. And all of these are, in fact, relevant to the Uyghurs. So I would say that there's more than just self-determination, that there are other aspects of rights which have a collective dimension. And that's why I actually refer to it in relation to a Uyghur identity, their culture, language, and religion, because, in my opinion, all of that is being actually targeted by the policies, intentional policies, by the government of China to get rid of, in a sense. I think we need to be actually quite clear, even rather blunt on that aspect. In relation to genocide, my mandate actually does not cover genocide, strictly speaking. However, you may have heard when I was referring to the situations there, I did refer to genocidal acts. And in a certain way, I've mentioned it quite a few times without actually clearly arriving at the conclusion, because I've never been asked to do that. I've never, strictly speaking, had an opportunity to actually examine this question very closely as a special rapporteur. I've kind of, to be very honest, I went around it, kind of suggested it could be the case, and I think that is a position that as special rapporteur I had to actually adopt, because to be fair to states and victims and civil society, one has to look at all the factors. And in my case, I've never conducted a mission in China. I was never asked to address the issue of genocide specifically under my mandate. Now that I'm not special rapporteur, I can perhaps look at this question more closely. Thank you.
We look forward to your finding tomorrow. Then.
Oh, God. Thank you. Inshallah.
I mean, so we still have a couple of questions on the fact that the Secretary General has not spoken up on the issue, on interference too, or any other points that were raised. Your comment on those.
Yeah, I think, like I said, when I mentioned that the UN has failed us, I also I want to include the Secretary General, because I think he was so outspoken on so many issues, on so many occasions, but and as he is right now on the current conflicts as well around the world, but I have never really heard him even pronounce the word Uyghur. So, you know, for a high-level person of the UN not to mention one of the most urgent crises around the world is deeply troubling. And to even also, I think it's even, you know, the question of access for Uyghurs, access to the Secretary General or his office or, you know, different offices, we just don't have access to them. And most of the time we have to go, you know, knock these doors with the help of many partners and many allies who facilitate those meetings or access. So it's kind of frustrating when you're one of the communities that are going through so much, but you don't have that access. Even, you know, like we know that, for example, all organizations working on China, they don't have ECOSOC status, you know, at the UN. So that makes it very difficult to raise our voice. I mean, there are obviously many ways, but it always comes with challenges. So when you're always confronted with challenges and limitations to access, it's hard to push this. So I think we've been calling on the Secretary General, and when I say we, it's not just the Uyghur community, it's also Tibetan groups, Hong Kong groups, the whole Chinese human rights defenders, everyone. We've been calling on his office, on him, to specifically mention these issues and also call for accountability measures on China, call for you know, a resolution that sets independent inquiry or a working group or even a special rapporteur on China, but none of our concerns, none of our asks have actually been addressed. So when we see that, it's deeply frustrating, but we're not giving up, because we know that although this could be helpful, it's not the only way to go around and to raise our voices. And we're actually we were very, I think, encouraged by the appointment of the new High Commissioner, Volker Turk, when he arrived to office right after the publication of the report. And although his, I think, position is not as strong as we hoped for, it's still much better than the previous High Commissioner, whose name I'm now going to name. But I think there's a lot of still, after so many disappointments and so many challenges for our community, there's still some optimism, and I think we're still expecting something out of the UN system. And I think this year there were so many opportunities to raise the Uyghur issue at the UN. We attended the CEDAW review, the SESCAR review, the next UPR is coming up on China in January, and I think from my experience also engaging with diplomats, engaging with civil society groups, there's this kind of fatigue from the Chinese narrative. You know, when we organize side events at the UN, diplomats are not buying the Chinese narrative or the Chinese message so easily compared to before.
Thank you very much. Fernand de Varenne, I have a question. The Convention on Genocide is not only on punishment, but also on prevention. And this is a legal instrument of very strong weight. Help us just to redraw the boundary between punishment and prevention if there is an ongoing activity which is somehow genocidal. So how to prevent? It is up to the member states of the UN to call to the bodies, because we are obliged. There is an obligation to act, even to prevent. Could you just touch upon on this prevention which we are committed to pursue? Thank you.
I love the question, because I think this is an area where the United Nations has, I don't want to use the word failed so much, but when I mentioned earlier the rise in the number of violent conflicts around the world, let's be very clear. Prevention should be a priority of the United Nations, but almost all of the efforts of the United Nations are actually in conflict resolution. And I think this is a major failure or gap. Let's call it a gap for now. And one of the main reasons, in my opinion, is because for the United Nations, prevention implies interference in the domestic affairs of a state. Because what I did not mention is that most of today's violent conflicts are internal. They're domestic. They're inside a state. And in fact, most of these involve minorities or ethnic religious issues. But that is politically delicate, as we've been saying. Many states now are actually opposing their sovereignty, their state sovereignty, to the interference of international human rights, much more today than 20 years ago. We have gone backwards in terms of, in my opinion, in terms of the international community or member states of the UN accepting the application of human rights standards in their internal affairs. So, as you say, the Convention Against Genocide highlights the importance of prevention. But in recent years, we've actually, I think, at the United Nations, moved away from prevention because states are reasserting their sovereignty in many areas. As you may know, even the United Kingdom, the current government of the United Kingdom has talked about withdrawing from the European Convention for Human Rights. There's a movement backwards. During the previous administration of President Trump, there actually was a suggestion that international human rights had gone too far, and there was a special commission which did present a report on what are the real human rights, not the international human rights, but the real human rights that the U.S. government should respect. What I'm actually indicating is that, as you rightly pointed out, prevention of genocide should be one of the main focus of the efforts of the United Nations. But given the current political and diplomatic context, the United Nations has perhaps been shying away from that. And most of its efforts are towards resolution and not prevention. We actually have been seeing a huge increase in hate speech, but also incitement to genocide in social media in many parts of the world. And many governments don't know how to handle this tsunami of hate, I think, as the UN Secretary General mentioned. I call it the poisoning of the mind by misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. So all of that, I should say there are some efforts done on prevention. There is the special advisor to the UN Secretary General on the protection, responsibility to protect, and also the prevention of genocide. But still, we will need to work towards, I think, a United Nations which truly fulfills its mission. We will need to head towards a change in the context and member states actually becoming true defenders of human rights in a way which I think most member states have been shying away from too recently. And I'll try to end on a positive note. This is a very dark period for the international community in terms of respecting human rights around the world. Let's not kid ourselves. But on a positive note, because as a special rapporteur, by the way, we have to be optimists. It is in the darkest moments that we have to focus on the light. And now is the moment we have to do that even more than in the past, because now are the most difficult periods that we have to actually try to have a truly universal system for the protection of the rights of those who are the most vulnerable and marginalized. That's why we need human rights, international human rights now. It's difficult. It's going to be even perhaps impossible, it seems, but we will never make progress unless we persevere and move forward. Is that inspirational?
Yes.
Thank you. I'll finish on that.
Just before closing, I know that we're reaching the end of this panel and of this forum, but I just wanted to give the floor back to Arja Eri for any last remarks, and in particular, I think the question about the Secretary General that will speak to your experience.
I thought I was going to get away without answering that one. Well, I don't want to dilute excellent comments from colleagues. I think everyone did a great job of answering. So I'll keep my remarks short, or I hope to keep my remarks short. As regards the SG's office, I think the best way to answer this question is that, as you mentioned, Special Rapporteur, the United Nations and the Secretariat is currently working in the context of shrinking space for human rights, shrinking space for civil rights, shrinking space to bring 193 countries together under the concept of human rights, right? And it's very evident when you look at topics that were raised for the GA this year, what the Secretariat brought forward when all prime ministers, all heads of state were coming to New York to discuss while Ukraine was being invaded, while genocide is going on as regards to Uyghurs, while many conflicts are taking place around the world. The topics that were centered for the GA were global health, global development, and climate change. Now, these are important topics, and these are global issues, and these are urgent issues. I represent many millennials and Gen Z, so I'm excited about these issues being discussed. That said, is that what the UN should be discussing when, you know, the world is literally on fire? And what I take away from this is not to criticize the UN, not to criticize my former colleagues, but I sympathize, because it said to me, you know, that this is where we've come. This is where we're at. We are living at a time where perhaps, you know, the Secretariat doesn't see any hope for bringing together 193 countries based on human rights. You know, it just doesn't seem possible, nor based on national security or security issues or peace, right? So we have to talk about climate change. We have to talk about global health. We have to talk about global development. We have to talk about SDGs, because those are issues where there might be a slight space of entry points to bring these countries together. And perhaps through SDGs we could talk about peace. Through SDGs we could talk about human rights. But I think it says a lot about the global context in which we live in. And my observation working under this current SG is that, you know, when it comes to human rights, his style is to delegate to the Undersecretary General. So if we're optimistic about it, I think it means that there's a lot more that's been delegated to the Human Rights Office to work on this. There's a lot more that's been delegated to the special mechanisms, to special procedures to work on this. So that would be my observation. And to wrap up, it's been healing to hear so much validation of everything I think we've been experiencing and thinking when we see diluted headlines, diluted analyses, non-existent analyses of violations going on. And as a politician, I think my job is to unite and inspire as much as possible. So I would like to wrap up by asking all of us sitting here today, to pledge in all fronts that we work in every front that we work in, that we will not dilute any information that comes towards us. We will not dilute the language we use when we talk about this genocide, and that we will not leave anybody behind. Thank you for being here today, and again, thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you so much. It's much easier as a moderator to finish when you're preceded by such inspirational speeches at the end of the day. But I just wanted perhaps to give a 1 minute wrap up in terms of like what I hope that the audience today got away from this panel. I think the first message, of course, is please continue engaging with the UN, or start doing if you've not done so. This means, of course, keep on bringing your information, and as you say, not diluted information, but really the facts and your analysis and your conclusion. This is really essential for the work of special rapporteurs of the UN Human Rights Office, of us NGOs that sit in Geneva. So please continue documenting and engaging. Keep on pressuring your governments through parliaments, through civil society. That is really essential in terms of shifting positions, and reach out. Reach out to other peers, in particular in the Global South, so that they can shift their government's positions and that we can finally find some way through at the UN, and all this back to the really powerful impact of stories. And when I say this, I looked at Kelvin, whom I had the pleasure to share a 40 hours flight from Geneva to Tokyo. And I just get reminded all the time of the power of stories and of the importance of appealing to each other's humanity when we reach out as civil society, as parliaments, as academics. So please continue doing what you do in an excellent manner. Continue reaching out to the UN and to others outside of your countries. And with this, I thank everyone for attending this panel. And well, I'm not the one declaring the end of the forum, but I'll leave this privilege to Sumritai and the organizers. Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you. Merci beaucoup.
İki günlük fəaliyyətimiz məyədə ayaqlaşdı. 2 günün yanqı qatnışıb bəqninglərə köpdən-köp rəhmət. Əmdə bir uzatuş fəaliyyəti vardı. Hazır Abduz kəp oldu. Şu Abduzğa oturub uzatuş fəaliyyəti mansaq oldu. Əndə mən Nəxmeydan tərcümanınki 3 günni